afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's IVI and Empower webinar. I just want to share my screen. So today's webinar is entitled From Policy to Practice, Bridging the Gap. I am Angela McCourt, Director of Data and Technology in Commission Naman, and it is my privilege to chair today's panel discussion, where we'll explore one of the pressing challenges in today's data-driven world, the divide between policy creation and real-world execution. For those joining the IVI webinar for the first time, the Innovation Value Institute is a multidisciplinary research institute at Maynooth University. It is focused on digital transformation and technology adoption. This webinar is held in collaboration with Empower. Empower is an $10 million research programme dedicated to the multidisciplinary field of data governance. It is funded by industry partners and Scientific Foundation Ireland, which brings together leading experts from academia, public sector and private enterprises to address the current challenges in data governance. Co-founded by Research Ireland and industry partners, Empower brings together 4 leading Research Ireland centres, Lero, Adapt, Insight and Future Neuro, and it is coordinated by Professor Marcus Helford at IVI. This webinar is being recorded for on-demand access via the IVI website. So in our rapidly expanding global data and AI landscape, national and international policies like the Data Sharing and Governance Act, Data Act, and the AI Act are instrumental in shaping frameworks for data management, the sharing of data, the security of that data, and obviously data privacy. These comprehensive legislation set out the standards that aim to guide us toward responsible and effective use of data and AI technologies. However, drafting these policies is just the beginning. The critical challenge lies in translating these high-level objectives into actionable and implementable practices across diverse sectors and industries. In today's webinar, we'll explore this critical issue, the policy gaps that often arise between the what of policy objectives and the how of practical implementation. Our goal is to discuss the steps needed to close these gaps effectively. We are very fortunate to have with us a panel of experts who bring a wealth of knowledge and expertise in this field. Today we have Annette Denver, who is Head of Data Policy in the Data Governance Unit, the Office of Government Chief Information Officer, Depender. Daniel Castro, Vice President and Director in the Centre for Data Innovation, that's Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. Emer Farrell is the Scientific Project Officer, Digital Economy Unit for the Joint Research Centre, the European Commission, and Eric O'Donovan, Head of Digital Economy Policy in IBEC. I encourage all of you to engage during the webinar. Please feel free to submit your questions through the Q&A function at any time. We'll address as many as possible during our Q&A session at the end. Your comments on today's topics are also very welcome. First up, I'm delighted to introduce Annette Denver. In her current role, Annette leads the development and implementation of data governance strategies, policies and standards. She serves as a key advisor to the Data Governance Board and several government committees focused on data sharing. Annette has been instrumental in the successful implementation of the Data Sharing and Governance Act and various initiatives outlined in the Public Service Data Strategy. I have personally benefited from the many frameworks and guidelines expertly developed by the Data Governance Unit. So Annette, I invite you to share your insights on bridging the gap between policy and practice.
Thanks very much, Angela. Just give me a second to share the screen. Hopefully that works now for everybody. So a formal thank you to Angela and to good afternoon to everybody on the panel today. And a thank you to the IVI and Empower for asking me to present my view on today's topic, from policy to practice, bridging the gap. A little bit about myself. Angela, you covered it really well there. I head up the data policy team in the data governance unit of OGCIO. As you can see, I work in one of the 12 divisions in the Department of Public Expenditure, NDP Delivery and Reform. We never call it that, we call it Depender. The Data Governance Unit was established specifically to implement new policies for data sharing within the public service. My team works to establish best practice data governance across the public service, and more specifically, in a practical way, we translate legislation and policy into meaningful processes and guidance so that it can be understood by most people, not just public servants. So I'd like to kick off today with some inside information about how we do that. Now, I appreciate everybody is not a policy implementer, but I'm going to make the assumption that everybody has a little bit of policy in their life at the minute. So what do you see in this picture? Are they creating a gap or are they bridging one? And I want to begin by asking you to consider why policy is created in the first place. And one way to look at it is to consider that the function of any policy is essentially to bridge a gap and create opportunity. And there's different ways to do that. Most policy life cycles are usually linear or a repeating circular cycle. And I find it interesting, actually, recently, the UK reviewed their own policy development and they compared the process to a game of snakes and ladders. And I thought how brave and how true that actually is, where you go up a ladder, you make a breakthrough, and then you hit a barrier and you go backwards a little bit. So, and in fact, if we want to discuss how gaps appear between policy and implementation, you really have to start before the policy is created. Consider treating the whole process like a project. Set up a project board, understand your stakeholders, your resourcing, your risks, your issues, and all that project stuff. The new policy, every new policy should start with a problem statement or a definition of what success looks like. And even agreeing that I find to be very difficult. Whether it's big EU policy or a policy just within your local department or your business unit, in order to have a robust outcome at this first stage, you need to talk to various stakeholders. That's one of the inputs. But too many stakeholders actually dilute this process, and you end up with a very watered down objective. So balance is really key at that first stage. From an EU perspective, there's lots of working groups you can join when policy is being developed. For me, it's the EU Join Up group, because they work in data sharing all the time. And another thing you don't ever see written down in reference to policy creation is the need to be brave when you create policy. Of course, there's times when you need to be controlled, but you're about change management as well, and bringing change. When you bring change, you have to be brave. Now, the Irish government has a clear strategy that policy development should be evidence-based. You'll find economists and statisticians seconded across the public service to support this. And also, I would encourage everybody to use research. There's lots of research available about particular policy. Now, understanding your as-is environment, and that includes understanding other legislation or other policy, which might be international. It might be just local domestic strategy. It might be frameworks, timelines, but do map it, because it is a very confusing space to be in. Map it logically, and that can take the form of a dashboard, a log, a spreadsheet, or whatever is local to your practice. A useful tool might be, for example, the EU AI Act classifier and compliance checker. It's a good initial basis for understanding how the AI Act will be applied to use cases. In terms of development, then you also have to look back and use lessons learned. We use surveys all the time. We talk to other policy implementers, both domestic and international, and get their insights about gaps of the past. And you look forward. Some people call it horizon scanning, whichever phrase you use. We're nearly halfway through the EU digital decade. And there's so much legislation out there that we actually use in our team. We call it airspace. And we say the airspace is really busy right now. I don't know if that actually makes us air traffic controllers or not. I don't know. When you are, though, an implementer of policy, it is important to look at that policy airspace and understand when other policy is landing, whether that means it's being developed or you need to get involved in it, or it's being rolled out and you need to keep track of it. So keeping a timeline schedule is actually a really helpful tool to do that. And some consideration should be given to governance structures for implementation. And sometimes that is suitable to be written into the policy, and sometimes it comes as a support outside of the policy. So you'll be aware that GDPR, the AI Act, the EU Data Governance Act all have either regulatory bodies or competent authorities or bodies or oversight bodies to govern that implementation. And I would encourage you, don't be shy if including other examples of best practice, because they will have seen the gaps before and you can use that too. And it is always very useful to repeat the question as you are in the development process of policy. Is it valuable? Is this piece valuable to put into the policy, and will it meet my objective? And that will support your efforts to be brave. Now, engagement, advice giving and supporting implementation, all about communication as far as I'm concerned. There's a few points that I want to make about this. Communication training is hugely important for policy implementers. Everyone in our unit is trained in speaking and writing in plain English. And when you think about those who the policy is impacting, ordinary people, you can save a lot of time and confusion if you communicate in simple English. My slides today, very simple, very straightforward, and it's just something we do all the time. Getting bogged down in legislative speak can often confuse people who aren't used to it. There's of course times when you need it, especially around things like data protection and things like that. You need to use the legal phrases there, but aim for simplicity. Create a communications network. Let me explain what I mean by that. When we looked at how we were to implement the Data Sharing and Governance Act, which is an Irish public service piece of legislation related to data sharing, we knew we needed a communication approach that was both top down and bottom up. We approached the very top tier of the public service leadership to create a role in each department who would be advocates for new policy and who would be communicators within their own organisation and to help communicate all the new guidance that was coming out around that policy. These people are often close to data in their organisations. They may not be the decision makers, but they know the processes. They know what data comes in, what data comes out. And having that mandated by senior leadership has been hugely important. We are 3 years in, and the network has been one of the most important communication channels we have. The third point I want to make, and I don't ever hear about this in policy implementation, is the importance of a governance support team and a secretariat. Whilst many of their tasks are backroom tasks and often not seen, if there is a team of people who's going to find a gap, it's going to be that team. An example I might give you is that some of our legislation sets up operational tasks which are very repetitive in nature. That team wrote a suite of standard operating procedures for these repetitive tasks. And that process of creating a standard operating procedure really baselined the whole policy and found a few gaps. So what do you do when you find a gap? Rarely we create new policy to fix it. Rarely do we amend the existing policy. And sometimes we just change the process. The next point I want to make is that the translation of law into an understandable format, if you're not a legal person, is really hard. Again, most of the data governance unit have completed post-grad diplomas in data protection law, and that has become a fundamental part of our day-to-day working with policy legislation. So capability at source, hugely important. Resourcing. Don't underestimate the value of having enough staff. No, I've never met a team who's ever said we have enough people, but don't underestimate the impact. Policy implementation is not, in my experience, finite. Now, of course, when you come to evaluation, you can use your original problem statement or compare what success looks like and that vision that you had at the beginning. Review the data and the metrics you use to create the policy. That's why evidence informed is really important. And it should not take you by surprise if you are monitoring the progress of policy implementation as you would go along. So KPIs are a really obvious metric that you can use to measure your success anywhere in the implementation stage. And go back to that network of advocates that you set up and ask them for feedback on the local impact of policy. What does it look like in your organization? The public service has just successfully completed a pilot for virtual data rooms, which can use the policy data to directly answer the question, has this policy been successful? Or will this policy have a positive impact on a particular societal issue? Data rooms are set to become a very powerful tool in policy evaluation. And when all that works really well, which it does every time, it delivers not just bridging the gaps, but also the creation of a platform for innovation. From a public service perspective, the raft of database legislation in our airspace brings not just safeguarding of our information, but it opens up opportunity for all people, for business, and for the public service itself. I'm going to say thank you there, and I'm going to stop sharing. Over to you, Angela.
Yeah. Thank you, Annette, for sharing your invaluable insights there on bridging the gap between policy and practice. So you bring a wealth of expertise in data policies and that kind of practical implementation of how to get those regulations, and you've really provided us there now with a solid foundation for today's discussion. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Daniel Castro, Vice President at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation and Director of ITIF Centre for Data Innovation. Daniel is a leading expert in information technology and internet policy with a focus on privacy, security and data innovation. And I know from speaking with Daniel that he is passionate about maximising the opportunities to utilise data effectively and responsibly. So Daniel, we look forward to hearing your perspectives on how we can leverage data to its fullest potential while navigating the complexities of policy and regulation.
Thanks so much, Angela. And it's great to be here and participate in this discussion. I really enjoyed Annette's overview of this policymaking process and how policymakers are thinking about implementing data and the challenges that we've had in policymaking in the past. So I work at a think tank based in the United States, but we have branches in Europe, in the UK, Canada, Korea. We really look at global data policy and how data-driven innovation is occurring around the world. What I wanted to talk about briefly is, the ways that we're seeing the challenges around data changing and where barriers exist and how to overcome them through different data sharing models that we're seeing on the ground. So the starting place is, what are the barriers to data sharing? Why do we need to have governance that not only facilitates the data protection, data security, and other types of mechanisms, but also overcome some of the problems we see in the market. So, first we have legal barriers. So there are a host of laws and regulations that govern how data can be collected, shared, used. And these legal barriers, these legal requirements can sometimes be a barrier to data sharing. They can be a barrier, particularly for multiple organizations combining data together. One important change that we've seen in this kind of big data world that we live in now, compared to, say, 30, 40 years ago, is that it used to be you might have one organization that would collect all the data it needed around a particular problem. It might be a government agency, it might be an international NGO, something like the ITU or the UN, maybe a large nonprofit, or even a corporation. But increasingly, when you're looking at how data is being used today, data is being collected, it's real-time data, so it's collected from sensors or sensor networks, Internet of Things devices all around the world. It's being shared across borders, it's being shared across institutions. And it's not being necessarily all aggregated in one spot. It's something that is this kind of real-time network that needs to operate. And so that's why these legal barriers can be such a problem, because it's not about just getting the data to one final centralized point at one point in time. It's about how do we have this ecosystem, this data commons that can be built and used. But so beyond the legal barriers, we also see social barriers. So resistance to data collection or data sharing, sometimes based on individual or collective values, sometimes based on fears about how data might be used, sometimes based on fears or concerns about the various institutions that would have access to data. We see technical barriers. This comes up quite a bit, particularly when you're talking about interoperability, the lack of standards that might exist in certain areas, or even just challenges with interconnectivity between different technical systems. And finally, there's the economic barriers. There's cost to sharing data. There's cost to collecting data. There's also the question about who actually benefits. And so while there could be a collective benefit to data sharing, those individual benefits might align with the various actors who have to engage in these actions. And so there's a whole host of complex social, technical, economic, and legal factors. And so we did a study that looked at what are some of the data sharing models out there, and how have they overcome different challenges. And there's in particular 6 that I want to talk about, and I'll just kind of briefly run through each of them and talk about how they're shaping kind of new opportunities. And the main takeaway I have here isn't that one of these models is better than the other. It's that we need lots of different data sharing models out there to solve different types of institutional problems. And one thing that I hope we see more and more of is public-private partnerships around creating more of these data sharing models, where regulators are helping facilitate them, where the private sector is aware of them, and sometimes they're doing them on their own, but really trying to overcome some of these more systemic barriers to data sharing. So the first is data sharing partnerships. This is where you have agreements between one or more organizations to share data. This is usually a legal agreement. This is probably the most simple type of agreement that we have out there. And it basically says, can different parties come together and share their data sets? Can they define who has access to data, what the intellectual property rights will be, maybe what cost sharing looks like, and put that data out there. And we see this in various forms. A large one that we've seen, for example, is with 23andMe, the company that does genetic testing. They formed a number of data sharing partnerships around research with nonprofits, academic research centers, where again, they just outlined a set of rules and then shared that data with these third parties. Moving on to a little bit more complex, you see data consortia. So here's where you have organizations that actually are pooling the data for the benefit of the group. So it's a set of institutions that come together with reciprocal data sharing agreements. And what's interesting here is that you can see that this can create what we would call a tipping point, where at some point, usually early on, there's a lot of value for most of these organizations to keep the data to themselves. They don't want to share their data because they really, if they share their data, somebody else has access to something that's usually giving them some kind of unique value. But when you have enough participants in a data sharing consortium, it actually changes the information environment so that it's actually better to be part of the consortium than to be out of it. And so, for example, we've seen this happen in the pharmaceutical industry, where there's been various data sharing consortium developed, sometimes around rare diseases, sometimes around different types of research areas. And these companies would traditionally not want to give access to their information because that's where their competitive advantage is. But at a certain point, they realize they can actually change where they're innovating. It's no longer about exclusive access to data. It's about what they're doing with the data. It's actually changing where innovation occurs. And it's a very powerful model. The challenge here is how do you actually get to that tipping point? And so you usually have to have some kind of motivated actors or set of actors willing to come together and push to get to that point. Another model we see are data trust. This is something that was pioneered primarily in the UK. And the concept here is that you have a trusted third party, trusted intermediary, to which the data owners delegate their rights. So this third party then makes data sharing decisions on behalf of the data subjects. This can, they can also, set a set of rules for how the data will be collected and aggregated, under which conditions will it be shared. And it really helps address that problem of having I think a lot of people are familiar with the tragedy of the commons, where you have overuse of something. You also have the tragedy of the anti-commons, where you have so much disjoint ownership over property rights, or in this case, data rights, that it's actually hard to bring it all together. So the point of a data trust is it allows individuals to very easily delegate those rights. This is something that, for example, has also been used for genomic research or health research, where you give patients the ability to donate their data to a third party, and then that third party is entrusted to manage those rights to maximize, for example, the research benefits that could come out of this collective data. A similar type of model is a data cooperative. You can think about cooperatives in other areas where the idea is really have bottom-up governance. So in this case, you have bottom-up data governance, where individuals can voluntarily pool their data, have that cooperative collectively negotiate on their behalf. We've seen this, for example, with rideshare drivers, where drivers wanted to make sure that they're actually getting the benefits of this data. And so they created a collective and then negotiated on behalf of all of the drivers on how their data would be monetized. We've also seen this in the agricultural sector, not too surprising given you have cooperatives in that sector already, around data rights. So growers or producers coming together and saying, we're going to all put our data together and collectively negotiate. The challenge that we see here, one of the biggest challenges, of course, is that the value of data often is in the aggregate, not at the individual level. And so it's hard to sometimes find that economic value or create the economic incentives for data sharing. My value individually might be worth just a few cents, but collectively it's worth thousands or millions. But dividing that up sometimes can be very difficult, particularly when the value is in the completeness of the data set, not in any individual right. So there's definitely some economic challenges in this model. One of the last models I want to talk about is the Cooperative Research and Development Agreement, or a CRADA. This has been used in the United States in particular. And this is where government agencies will share data with the private sector under the conditions that they don't have to pay anything. So the government isn't providing any funding. They're providing the data. Sometimes they're providing access to systems. And the exchange here is that the private sector gets access to data that they would otherwise not have. And in return, they're going to provide something back to the government, something of value. But they're also receiving the right that they can commercialize some of the something that they're doing with this. So the Department of Commerce, it's called the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. They manage all the satellite data in the United States, for example. They study oceans, so large terabytes of data. They ran into this challenge where they had massive amounts of data that they weren't able to release publicly, and they knew had commercial value. They knew it had research value, but they also knew that they didn't have funding to make widely available. And so what they did is they created this CRADA with the private sector, where they allowed multiple companies to come in, and under the condition that they would make the data available to the public, they could also offer value-added services on top of this. So the companies could come in, commercialize this, and in exchange, they were providing this value of open access to this data for lots of researchers who would otherwise not have access to it. So it was a net win for the government. Again, no cost to these agencies. A net win for the public who got access to information they wouldn't otherwise have, and a net win for these companies who were able to offer a commercial product that they also would not have been able to offer without this. So that kind of multiple win option is, again, something you can get with these kind of innovative public-private partnerships. And finally, there's federated data analytics. So here's where we kind of try and attack the problem in a different way. Instead of saying that we're going to figure out the best way to bring the data together, instead we say, let's leave the data where it is. Let's allow the data to be stored in disparate locations, but instead decentralize the analytics. So we have things like federated data analytics, federated machine learning, where the goal is you leave the data in place, which addresses oftentimes the legal issues, sometimes even the economic issues, but you do centralize the aggregated insights. So this is useful also when organizations might be unable or unwilling to share their data, which again, sometimes it's legal basis, sometimes it's just the complexity of getting approval for that would be too hard. So in all of these models, the goal is really to rethink how data is collected and used, and find new ways to overcome the various barriers to data sharing that we see. Both of these, both the challenges and then the solutions, we've kind of gone into more detail in these two reports. Both are available on our website, datainnovation.org. So if anyone's interested in digging deeper, I just wanted to leave up the link for that. And I'll stop there and just say, I think this is a really important issue as we're moving forward, because the goal is really, how do we break down barriers? And some of this will be done at the policy level, but some of this is going to be very much on the applied level, the implementation level. And that's where I think we need these different data sharing models to overcome the challenges that we see in the market today. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Daniel, for that and your valuable insights. And I'm really looking forward to discussing further the importance of increasing that data collection, that data sharing, to close that data divide in our Q&A session. Now, I would like to introduce Emer Farrell, a Scientific Project Officer at the European Commission's Joint Research Centre. Emer researches AI and data ecosystems, focusing on EU data spaces, responsible data governance, and digital transformation of the public sector. With 20 years of experience, including leading Ireland's national AI strategy and shaping digital law at the UN, World Economic Forum, and Amnesty Tech, I'm particularly keen to learn more about data spaces myself, as I know that this may play a vital role in how Commission Imam put policy into practice under the Digital Services Act. It'll also be very interesting to hear how national policy fits within that European policy perspective. Emer, we're eager to hear your insights on bridging the gap between policy and practice.
Thanks very much, Annette. So I'm just going to share my screen. Can everybody see that?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I'll start maybe by explaining where I work, so the European Commission Joint Research Centre, and then what is our role in data sharing policy, governance and use. So the Joint Research Centre is actually a Directorate General of the European Commission, but we are independent and we work as the Science and Knowledge Service of the European Commission. So our role is really to support EU policies with independent evidence and advice throughout the whole policy cycle that Annette outlined earlier. So in terms of our contribution and our interest or perspective on EU data sharing and governance, we look at this from a number of different perspectives. So one is through the lens of inclusive data governance. So we support the implementation of the EU Data Governance Act through research on some of the mechanisms that are promoted within and regulated within the Data Governance Act, for example, data intermediaries and also data altruism organizations. We also try to develop tools and guidance to assist with the implementation of the Data Governance Act. So, for example, digital consent management tools, which will be important in the context of data altruism. We also will be doing some work on the Data Act, so preparing an implementation toolkit for the Data Act, which would include things like case studies, good practices and guidelines, and then also conducting stakeholder engagement to understand what are the needs and how are things working on the ground. But generally, we provide scientific support from both a technological and also a sociological and an economic perspective. We have also done a lot of work on common European data spaces, which appear in the Data Governance Act and also in the Data Act. And we're looking at horizontal requirements and needs for European data spaces. So we work together with European Commission DGs to help understand what are the needs and to provide tools and evidence to help with the establishment and operation of European data spaces. So on this slide, you can see a selection of some of our reports that are relevant in the area of data sharing and data governance. I won't go through them all in detail, but you can see on the top, these are some of the most recent ones. So one on the Green Deal data space, which is actually broader than just looking at the Green Deal data space. It's also looking at new and innovative models for data sharing, particularly in the realm of environmental and geospatial data. The second one there is on digital consent management tools for data altruism, which I mentioned earlier. And then we have European data spaces, data intermediaries, privacy enhancing technologies. We've also done reports on synthetic data, data sovereignty. There are lots of different ones there, citizen-generated data, and you can find those all on our website. Why are we interested in exploring data ecosystems and enablers? So we've heard from the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen that Europe needs a data revolution. So we heard this in the context of her speaking about the political priorities for the new Commission. We know that data powers innovation, both economic and social, and it also shapes our economic and societal structures. And the EU is really promoting this idea of a society and an economy empowered by data. But at the moment, data sharing in the EU is suboptimal. So we have fragmented infrastructures, we have power imbalances, we have underused data, we don't have interoperability, or we don't have enough interoperability. So there will be a new European data union strategy put forward, but we already have a European data strategy, and we have a number of different regulations that flow from that, which we'll look at in a moment. But from our perspective, we are trying to provide scientific evidence for the scoping and implementation of common European data spaces, but also for the other EU data regulations and that govern data governance. We will very shortly be establishing a data sharing policy lab, and through this, we'll be able to test different data sharing models and data governance approaches in a controlled environment, looking again at both technical and also organizational and legal and economic aspects. So very quickly, because I know you're all familiar with these, looking at the EU data strategy. So there are various pieces in the EU data governance puzzle. I'm showing here them as a Lego system, so building brick by brick with the different regulations. And here on this slide, which you've probably seen before, we see the Data Act, the Data Governance Act, Digital Markets Act, the Implementing Act under the Open Data Directive. So these are just some of the different pieces in that puzzle. And we really need to see the shape of EU data governance and how all these different regulations interplay and interact, because all of that provides us with something that's more than the sum of its parts, so to speak. The Data Governance Act has 4 different pillars. So it's focusing on reuse of research data held by public sector bodies. It also provides a framework for new data intermediaries. It promotes data altruism for purposes of general interest, and it sets up a European Data Innovation Board, which is an important institution for also providing guidance on how the Data Governance Act should be implemented. And all of this should create a horizontal framework for the creation of a single market for data. I'll skip through this, but it's just giving you some examples of what the Data Act does, what sort of mechanisms it promotes to improve access to data, and to help us get more value from data. In the same way, the Data Governance Act will facilitate data sharing through a number of different mechanisms. So this is just a little humorous slide. So we're doing data governance, but what is it? So it's, that thing that you do with your data. So what actually is data governance? Well, we would say that data governance is about trying to maximize the benefits of data access, use, and sharing, while at the same time addressing risks, protecting rights, structuring relations of different data actors or people with an interest in the data, and assigning responsibilities. There are numerous different definitions. The World Bank has one, the OECD has one, but we've taken the particular lens of inclusive data governance. And that would refer to initiatives for data sharing, control, and use that promote alternatives to some of the dominant monopolistic and exploitative data practices. So then what is data empowerment? Seeing as the organization or the project hosting the webinar today is called Empower. So data should be of, by, and for the people. So we produce data. Data doesn't just come out of the air or flow on rainbows. It's something that's produced, that's reused. And we participate and should participate, should be able to participate in systems of data collection, use, and sharing. So data empowerment should give more people more say over their data and more control and agency over their data. But for that to happen, we need more experimentation and understanding in order to develop approaches that can facilitate this. And that is very much what the current EU regulation is trying to do. So through the mechanisms proposed in the Data Governance Act and in the Data Act, it's trying to foster experimentation with these different models and also to regulate them in a way that will ensure greater value and fair access to data for everyone. So I don't know how many of you have seen this movie, Everything Everywhere All at Once, which came out about 2 years ago. It's a funny movie, but anyway, it takes place in various different universes, the multiverse. And in it, there is a bagel. So I'll explain the relevance of the bagel. On the bagel, one of the characters in the movie decides to put everything on this bagel. Every type of seasoning, every type of flavor, everything. It's called the Everything Bagel. And in a way, maybe this is what we're trying to do with EU data governance. So with all the different regulations, we're trying to solve all the different problems. And that can maybe be quite confusing, but we do need to look at it in its entirety and as a whole. So we have yet to see how successful that approach will be, but I'm just using that metaphor to show you that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Then what is data value or data values? So we hear a lot about the value that can be generated by data, but within the EU context, there's also a very strong emphasis on the values that should govern, that should be involved in data governance. So the European way or approach is promoting data practices that are aligned with European principles and values. That promote not just innovation, but also a fairer data economy and society. And again, we see through the political guidelines for the new Commission, a lot of talk about this new European Data Union strategy. In the Draghi report, we've heard about the importance of data for competitiveness. But we need to think not just about data sharing, but what is data sharing for? So it needs to be for solutions, and solutions that are delivering public value and impact, so not just economic value. We have heard in academic discussions, we hear quite a lot about data as a regulatory object, but also as a resource. So data as a lot of economic metaphors are used around data as an asset, for example. We've also heard recently descriptions of data as a river, so as a commons or something that flows, that needs to be shared. There are relations of reciprocity. Data also as a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, or data as a diamond. So these are all different ways of thinking about data. And I think we need that. We need diversity in how we think about data. And metaphors and the language we use matters. So language can be limiting, but it can also be empowering. So if we have more diversity in how we speak about and how we think about and how we use data, this hopefully will lead to a greater number of people being able to derive value from it. So we really need to prioritize an ecosystemic and a relational approach to data. And then just the last point there is that it's really we need to create a data culture, and it's the culture and the people and the relationships involved in data that will actually help us to create value. I'll skip this. This is more around data spaces. The ultimate aim of some of this European regulation is to create a single European data space, but we also have this concept of data spaces. I'll just maybe say that space is not just a physical thing. Space is a socio-technical construct, and I think that's what we're seeing at European level. So it's a space that we are filling with values, with European values. Again, I'll skip onto that. So I'll just show you quickly what some of the JRC activities on data governance are, and how we move from theory to practice. So here are two of the key reports that we've produced recently relevant to the Data Governance Act. The first one, so a report on European data spaces. In this, we have at the JRC, so we have a very large number of data assets, data on things like water, on soil, on agriculture. We have roughly 3,000 data sets. And we're also the reference center for some of these things like monitoring air quality. So through all of this, we've developed a lot of learning and a lot of insights on data sharing ecosystems and what are the different things that work well, what things don't work well, what's needed from a technical perspective, what's needed from an organizational perspective. And we tried to distill some of these findings together in a report on data spaces. We also looked at what were the requirements for European data spaces across different EU policy documents. And we tried to translate those into technical and non-technical or functional and non-functional requirements. So things that are absolutely needed for a data space to function, and then other things that kind of determine the quality of that data space. We also looked at the different levels of governance in a data space. So it's important to remember that in addition to EU laws and regulations, there are also national laws and regulations that influence data governance in different member states. And then also at the organizational level, here we're looking in the context of a data space, but organizations will have their own governance schemas as well. As part of that report, we also developed a series of how-to information sheets on data sharing. So again, looking at the practice of data sharing and data governance. So we divided these into both technical and organizational categories. You've one example here. So how to foster a people-centered approach to data in a data space. This one takes an example of data sharing within a city context, provision of public services. And it's just a simple way of explaining what is the scenario and then what would be the proposed solution and giving some recommendations. So that's to try and help people put these things into practice. We have another report on data intermediaries in the context of the Data Governance Act. And in this report, we look at the different categories and criteria for data intermediation services providers within the Data Governance Act, but we also situate those in the broader landscape of data intermediaries. So Daniel had outlined a number of different data sharing structures or mechanisms like cooperatives and partnerships. So we look at that broader landscape and how some of those can promote more inclusive data governance. We look at the requirements within the Data Governance Act to qualify as a data intermediation service provider, and then what are the obligations that those entities have. And then we try to look at, in practice, what would that mean or how would that work, and how could these DISPs be sustainable? So there are a number of different obligations that they have. How are organizations understanding those in practice? And we held an empirical workshop to inform that report. We also have a report on digital consent tools for data altruism organizations. Within the Data Governance Act, these RDAOs, as they're called, they should use an EU data altruism consent form, which is being developed. And so we were asked, or we worked together with DG Connect to gather information on what are the digital solutions that are out there on the market for implementation of the data altruism consent form. And we made some recommendations around that, so you can look in the report. We have another report on data sovereignty clauses for local and regional governments that provides a number of examples from different cities and localities as to how they're using these data sovereignty clauses as an innovative mechanism. And then the most recent one is the report on the Green Deal data space. So again, it gives recommendations for how the Green Deal data space could work in practice, what would be innovative approaches to be used within that and more broadly. I'll skip over some of these, maybe just to say, and I think Daniel had already mentioned them, some of the challenges to consider in terms of EU data governance. So there are some social challenges, like resistance from some of the more powerful actors or large tech companies. There's also a challenge in terms of lack of awareness or knowledge around the regulations, and maybe also around some of the mechanisms through which to access data and share data. There can be technical challenges both at the infrastructure level and then at the literacy level. Then economic challenges. So how do we make these models sustainable and scalable? And then, of course, there are legal challenges. So with all the different regulations at all the different levels, there is a certain amount of complexity. Many of these are new and need to be tested, and we need to see how they work in practice. And I'd maybe just draw your attention to, there was an article in Politico today where they showed a survey where a number of companies had basically said that they view some of the EU rules around tech quite negatively. But again, I think we saw with GDPR, maybe that was also the case at the beginning, but we've seen that companies have learned how to work with that and how to implement it. So a couple of final reflections. The picture here, maybe some of you know this book. It's a lovely book called The Missing Piece Meets the Big O by Shel Silverstein. And I'm using this as an analogy maybe for EU data governance regulations, so that we have all these different pieces looking to see how they will fit together. And eventually, hopefully they will, but we have a bit of a road to travel still. So just my final reflections, and going back to the bagel reference. So the changing shape of EU data governance. Do we have this everything bagel, or is there a risk that the circle is kind of empty and that we end up with a black hole? So what are the opportunities? So we have all these opportunities, all these new mechanisms, but what is the local capacity to actually be able to implement these and understand them and participate them and orchestrate them? What are the different incentives that we need to build? So is there enough economic incentive at the moment for entities to establish themselves, for example, as data intermediation service providers? How will AI and generative AI fit into all of this? As we know, data is obviously crucial for AI and for training Gen AI. Very important to learn from experimentation and from practice, to focus on public value and the common good. We need to be able to measure the impact of these different pieces of legislation. There will be an evaluation coming up soon of the Data Governance Act, for example. So how will that change things? And then in terms of value creation, we really need a holistic vision for that. So right through from access to the data to then actually what solutions can that help us deliver. Probably we'll need to see more innovation and experimentation around methods to enhance privacy and security. We may see tools around automated compliance, for example, in data spaces. But with all these many initiatives running in parallel, there's going to be a need for very clear vision and leadership. So hopefully that's something that will come out of the new commission. Then, as I mentioned before, we need to create diversity in how we think about data and a more inclusive data culture. Institutions are going to be very important, both at the European level and then also national authorities for monitoring how these and for ensuring and overseeing the implementation of the different regulations. Courts will be important too for testing, and civil society also for ensuring accountability. Going back to things being more than the sum of their parts, there is perhaps a danger that we may see a lot of different fragmented national initiatives. So to what extent do we want to allow different approaches to bloom versus having a more integrated approach? And then we need more empirical research. We need to focus on end users and make sure that no person and no place is left behind. I'll maybe just to end, go back to my rainbow analogy. So I think, one characteristic of rainbows is that they respond to the atmosphere. And that's something I think we will need to see over time as well, see how these regulations will respond to changes, both in technology and also as we see the implementation, we'll see whether there is a need for adjustment. And I think, Daniel mentioned the point about data being useful in its aggregate. So again, if we think of the rainbow and the different colors, again, I think that emphasizes the need for diversity and participation within data governance and data sharing. And that's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emer, for sharing all of those insights on kind of data ecosystems and the role of the EU with respect to data sharing and data spaces in maximising our access to data. Really interesting stuff there, and it's amazing the volume of work that is been undertaking. So now I'd like to introduce our final speaker, Eric O'Donovan. With over 25 years of senior level experience in business, policy making and regulation at national and international levels, Eric brings extensive expertise in digital and AI policy. Since 2016, he has led and provided cross-sectional policy and representation services to IBEC networks in engaging national and international partners on digital and AI policy affairs. Eric represents IBEC on the government's Enterprise Digital Advisory Forum and is co-founder of Business 9 Plus Group, which engages with the Digital 9 Plus EU ministers. Eric, we're really eager to hear your perspectives on how kind of Irish businesses can effectively bridge the gap between policy and practice. Over to you.
Thanks, Angela. I don't know, are my slides showing on the screen at the moment?
Yes,
They are. Okay, perfect. It's just my screen set up here. So good afternoon, everybody. And geez, I don't know how to follow all that. I suppose my perspective on all of this is a bit broader than maybe previous speakers. So I suppose I'm with IBEC, obviously, the business group, and really, I suppose what I wanted to kind of touch on today is maybe 5 things really in this. I'm very struck by the title of this, from policy to practice and bridging the gap. So I've kind of put a subtitle here on this, that it's a shared journey.
Sorry, so, Eric, may I just interrupt you for a moment? You're sharing your slides, but in the notes view. So just in case you want to change it to.
For some reason, I have the slideshow
you
up
hit
here.
Display settings and duplicate. You'll be able to change that. Yeah.
Duplicate. There we go. Can you all see it now?
No, we're seeing just you again.
Oh dear.
Sorry, no, I probably shouldn't have interrupted you.
That's okay. That's absolutely fine. That's absolutely fine. Try that again.
There you go. Perfect.
Right. Okay. So as I said, I really only want to talk about 5 things, which I suppose, starting with what's the point of all of this in the first place. And I know Emer touched on this, and this is really about kind of creating value. It's value for public, it's economic. There's the dependencies between both, actually. And so it's the value, and it's created through the governance and obviously the innovation and all this. I want to touch on the policy as I see it, the practice, progress, and then some parting thoughts. So I suppose the first thing is, again, I suppose this will be all available afterwards, so I'm not going to go through everything in this. First of all, it's pretty obvious to anybody that we're quite a digitalized society. 94% of households have internet access. 95% of internet users use it daily. And bit I'm a big fan of there is robot vacuum cleaners, making our lives better. But the point here is that a society, we are a data society. I mean, and I suppose that's part of the driver behind this. Second thing is, of course, the actual sector itself. People may not be aware that there's 90,000 people employed in the ICT sector here in Ireland, and roughly 45% of them are in domestic firms, and about 55% are in FDI firms. So you keep that in your head, first of all, that there's roughly around 90,000 employed in the actual sector, but analysis that we've done shows that there's probably 3 times that number in the broader economy, because we're quite a digitalized economy, given that we have these number of sectors you have highlighted there on the right right-hand side of the slide, which include people like medical devices, pharmaceuticals, data processing machines, nutrition products. Basically, the share of our manufacturing is quite knowledge intensive, so therefore it's quite data intensive, and it's not necessarily personal data now. This is commercial data as well, right? So I suppose it's a broad economic issue is part of it. Interestingly as well, about 41% of our goods and services are transacted digitally. And I suppose other facts and figures, well, we're known as a hub in terms of digitally enabled services. And this isn't kind of an overnight thing. Some of the companies that are invested here in Ireland have been here for quite a while. And in some cases, maybe even predate membership of the EU. So, it's, I suppose what I'm trying to get across here really is essentially what other speakers have said here. It's a very, very important issue to the public, you and I, and to business. And so for that reason, as a business organization, we're quite interested in this. We're quite a campaign-driven organization as well. And this is to kind of illustrate really, I suppose, that our work, we work with companies at local level, regional, sectoral, national, EU, and then also OECD level. And we also work with D9 Plus Ministerial Group through a group we've co-founded called the B9 Plus, who are actually in this slide as well. And just here on the left-hand side here, we will touch on this later on in the presentation. I've included some detail of campaigns that we're running now with the ongoing, obviously, election campaign, and in terms of the change in the EU political cycle, some of the campaigns that we have there. Now, in terms of that's just really about us and just to start off with. But I suppose down to the question at hand, which is in and around the policy. And I suppose I couldn't fit this all in one slide, so I've used I thought what is a very, very useful IAPP slide here. I think it's quite useful just to show, I suppose, if we took the AI Act, which was I think mentioned earlier on in some of the presentations, and the actual linkages. So there's roughly around 23 linkages here that they've counted with other EU law. The point I'm trying to make with this slide is that we've had 5 years, actually we've probably had about 10 years, but really it's been quite intensive actually in the last 5 years of regulation in the digital value chain in Europe. And I suppose, as Emer has kind of alluded to, we'll probably have another while of clarifying that and implementing it. Because you see, there's so many dependencies between the various different laws, there's got to be a bit of work at clarifying this. So, and getting it to work in practice. So I don't think I'm kind of alone in this now in saying this. I think the Commission itself would be kind of even saying, how do we get this rule book, which we've developed, to work with competitiveness, work with innovation that brings these benefits that we all want, work with it, not against it. So that'll be the challenge for everybody going forward. I liked Annette's analogy of airspace. As you can see, the airspace is quite crowded here, and we're only talking about one law. So I suppose in a way, sometimes this whole area is almost described as kind of a spaghetti western, where people are saying we want the good, we fight the bad, and we definitely don't want the ugly in it. But we do need to kind of make sure that the implementation is coherent. Otherwise, we just end up with spaghetti, that it's it's too complex, or it puts people off, or it's too confusing for people to comply. So like it's about driving compliance, but it's also about getting the benefits. Like that's ultimately what we're trying to do at the end of the day. So this is kind of the policy. I suppose that's my reflection on the policy piece is about driving a bit of clarity, cohesion between the different laws and so on, in making the implementation kind of work on the ground. Because I think it's I'm not going to talk about the merits or demerits of law. It's more about, how do we implement what we've got now, and that's going to bring benefits and going forward. So, so also in terms of practice, I hope everybody can see this slide absolutely spot on. This is kind of a Ghostbusters slide. I'm following Emer by using lots of film analogies here. What I mean by a Ghostbusters slide is, the point is we have all this policy, but ultimately in implementation, who do you call? Okay, how do we actually how do we make this work? And so I thought, for the purposes, I had 5 minutes, and I thought I would try and map it out, which is what I've done here, hopefully. And apologies to anybody I've left out, okay, in the slide, but I have tried to map it out, that we have political leadership, we have the officials, and then we've got stakeholders. So, like, obviously regulators, government departments, industry. I've included industry as well. So, at the very top, like, we do have an awful lot, say at national level, we do have a variety of different strategies. The main one being the National Digital Strategy, which is led by Cabinet Committee Economic Recovery and Investment. We also have one on security. On paper, this is chaired by Taoiseach and is led by that. And then at officials, we've got a senior officials group. And then I suppose we've got the stakeholders. We've got a regulator group, which I think is very positive, because there's so many regulators that come together to kind of try and work in tandem. So that's a really positive signal. We have an enterprise digital advisory forum, that enables industry to, I suppose, to participate in this. We've got a government technology forum, which, again, I suppose Depender would be involved in that piece as well. And then you've got maybe the AI advisory committee as well, which is a new body, which is helping. But it's quite complex again, I suppose, is the point here is to make. And I suppose the other thing I think is quite interesting as a development is, obviously you've got the EU. There's an awful lot of EU law comes down as well, which is agreed. But you've got then kind of a new role for the Commission, as Emer pointed to, like as kind of a guide, which I think is super, and congratulations to you and your team, Emer. But as a regulator as well in areas like DSA and AI. And I think what's going to be interesting in regulation, maybe I'll just put this out and it might be part of the discussion, is an evolution of regulation, in that you're going to have things like sandboxes, for instance, which will mean new skills are required for regulators to assist. It's not necessarily assist in compliance, but to get into kind of regulatory innovation, I suppose, as much as helping innovation on the ground. So this will be a new area, new skill sets for regulators. So I think it's an interesting evolution. But for us as an organization, what it shows is that there's a linked imperative between being both a digital hub, which we are, but also as a regulatory hub. And seeing the regulators group, you'd have to say that's quite a good thing, to try and bring that coherence. For us, and I'll touch on those 4 pieces there, the lead, safeguard, enable, include. That's my kind of conclusion, by the way, just to give a kind of an early signal of it. But that's the policy, that's the practice. So we have a lot. The point I'm trying to make is, we have a lot of policy, we have a lot of practice. It's about trying to make it work in a harmonious way, I think, is the challenge, for us, for regulators, for policymakers, etc. Progress. What does it actually really mean in terms of, tangible things? Policy practice. Does it make us a more digital hub, or I suppose more digital, I suppose, in practice? Well, there are facts and figures in terms of what we're doing relative to other people in Europe. I don't really think it's worthwhile to compare ourselves against, say, the EU average. Because we are performing well, we are a front runner. What I think is more important for us to do is compare ourselves to other front runners, and which I haven't done in this slide. I have compared us against the EU average, but some things that kind of jump out to me, which is kind of important, is digital public service for business is excellent here, right? 100% against an EU target. It's really positive. We're doing well in the number of specialists we have in this sector, but we need to get more. The point I'm trying to make with this slide is, and again, people can go and look at it, the detail is this is kind of a marathon. It's not a sprint, and we're competing against other. We're both collaborating and competing against other nations in this. And you can see access to e-health records, which is a commitment at EU level. We have a long way to go. So that's not to beat ourselves up. It's just, maybe it might be an advantage to be kind of starting back, because you can see maybe the best path forward. But I think the point of this slide is really, we are a front runner. We've done well. Technology is evolving, and we can't be complacent. And I suppose we have to, and I include myself in this as well. Okay, so it's not I'm saying it's everybody else's job. That it's a shared journey for us. That we have a while to go. And it's not we can't be complacent. So parting thoughts. I'm going to have a parting thought on policy and then a parting thought on practice. So in terms of policy, as a group, ultimately you'd have to say there's probably 4 things we're asking for at a European level on the digital data space, if you like, and then 4 things at national level. In terms of the EU, we have to really make sure that the single market is complete, because it's not. And how we know it's not is that at least 1 in 5 SMEs trade online, and that's like 20%, nearly 20%. That's fantastic, but less than 1 in 10 trade online cross-border. That indicates there's still barriers between nations. And the average uptake of AI across the EU is about 8%. The target for 2025 is 75%. Now, that figure is an aggregation, and it masks, like say, for instance, in Ireland, say the average might be 8%, but we have to remember then that figure jumps up to closer to 40% when you're looking at larger businesses, about 18% when it's medium-sized businesses, and then it's only 5% when it's SMEs. So the point here is leveraging the market we have is going to be important. The second point, I think we've already touched on it, which is optimizing conditions for investment and growth. That's to do with the governance piece that we're talking about today. We've created a lot of regulation, and that's done. We are where we are. So how do we implement it? And it's about trying to make sure that these various different threads are aligned and implemented in a harmonious way that, as I said, works with innovation, that delivers all the benefits that the previous speakers have talked about. We have to be open to trade, because sometimes you don't always invent the technology here in Europe, and working with partners, you can get access to that while you, as I say, get into the third part of this, which is develop your own capacities, whether that's in infrastructure, whether it's in capacities and skills. And for us as IBEX, skills is hugely important across the board, whether it's literacy or it's the likes of me, who works in an office, who will need to understand all of this, to the people who are actually building these solutions. And then, of course, people who are in the, who sign the checks, if you like, that they can actually be entrepreneurial with this, and that that people in the street understand how it works as well, so that they can interact with it, because we're interacting with technology, technology is interacting with us, and we both this rubs off on each of us. So that's at European level. At national level, I think it's about investing in our governance. We have new regulators. It's about investing in them and supporting them, and playing the international role that we've been given. And also, I think I've put down catalyst. People might be wondering, what's that mean? It's because the country, if you like, or the state is actually a big economic actor, and through procurement, you can actually drive, I I suppose, digital progress is the point I'm trying to make there. Safeguarding people. This is about resources for the regulators, as I said, well, adequate resources, but it's also about building capacities. Because the things that regulators have been asked to do has changed. In other words, you'll have the sandbox idea. You've got the idea of so it may not be just about the trust. It could be about the excellence piece as well. So the excellence piece is about capacity building, say in the case of AI. It's about building an ecosystem. It's about enabling people. So it's about the connectivity. It's about how much we're spending on R&D. It's about enabling private investment in R&D. It's about supporting adoption. And then it's about inclusion. This last piece is actually probably the most important thing for us as an organization, right? Is the inclusion. This is about the resourcing of skills and the pathways in which people are going to, I suppose, no matter, if you're whatever industry you're working in, or you're looking for a job or changing jobs, that this is about resourcing those skills and having different pathways to do that, whether it might be micro credentials or apprenticeships or, third level. And, for us, it is about, we've noted like the unlocking of the National Training Fund. That's very positive. But again, some of it should be directed towards skills in the digital data and AI area as well, we believe. So I suppose finally, just a parting thought in terms of practice. So this is a brochure. It's not a cheap plug, I promise everybody on the call, but it's just, I suppose, we're looking at this ourselves, right? This is a brochure that's been put together for an upcoming course, and my colleagues, Technology Ireland, they run a skill net that's kind of involves public and private funding, and the idea is to develop skills, and they're working in partnership with Microsoft and the Analytics Institute, and this is about promoting data literacy and giving people, I suppose, skills to understand the principles of the data governance that everybody has kind of expressed eloquently today, and ensuring, look, we've got the data quality, security, and compliance that's going to empower responsible data use. And I think this has come about as well because it's kind of linked to the recognition, obviously, the value of AI, realizing that you've got to have good data governance in place. So this is a project or an initiative aimed at supporting that. So that's it. I'm going to stop there. I hope that was of interest to people. Just a bit of a broader take on it, and happy to join the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. I just feel like we have kind of gone a little bit longer than we had anticipated with the presentations. So I'm going to very quickly look. I know Darren O'Brien there has mentioned that there's interesting to see the difference between macro level definition of data governance from a policy reg perspective. And he uses the terms kind of macro, micro perspectives to distinguish the different issues and considerations. One thing that I had noted, Emer, was that you had said there's multiple definitions out there for data governance. Should we not be all kind of thinking about data governance kind of in like a clear definition of what that is, as opposed to having different definitions floating out there?
So I think, and the same can be said of data spaces, there are multiple definitions.
Yeah.
The EU is moving to try and harmonize some of those definitions. At the same time, I think in the case of data governance, so I think we can have some broad things that we agree on so that it, is a system of rules, rights, responsibilities between actors for collecting, sharing, using data. But then in terms of how that actually gets implemented, so I think there can be some flexibility around that. So basically we have centralized guidelines, we have horizontal regulations, but then at the individual organizational level, there should be some space for organizations or companies to be able to define their own governance schemes, because it can also vary a bit depending on the type of data, the purpose of the data sharing, the sector, and so on. And also there may be local or national things to take into account. But I think we need to agree indeed on the broad framework. And I think that's what the EU is trying to do with the Data Governance Act and the other horizontal frameworks and regulations. But for example, certain areas will have specificities. So with health data,
Sorry, just in the interest of time, because
Sure.
we've like 10 minutes left on this. So thank you so much for that. Gabriel there is asking that you mentioned national authorities on data. Is anyone on the panel aware of who the national authority is in Ireland? So I'll open that up in case anybody can answer that, maybe Annette.
Yeah, for the completely gone blank. The Data Governance Act, the CSO, is the competent body.
Competent authority, and they also have like the National Statistics Board, which kind of feeds into their policies and things like that as well. So there's probably a number of agencies there that could fall into that remit. So just talking there, and you mentioned it, and I think everybody on the panel mentioned it about skills. And you mentioned, Annette, particularly about being certified in data privacy. How do people feel about, being certified in, say, AI governance or something like that? Is that something that we need to be thinking about? And I know, Eric, you talked about, as a regulator, we need a specific skill set. So, I mean, what kind of tools in our skill set, like what kind of things do we need in that?
Well, AI literacy, is called out in the new AI Act, and it's going to be a requirement from February of next year. Now, it's not defined. Some in industry are concerned about that, but there's others would feel, so long as you've got a plan in place where you're kind of outlining, this is what I'm going to use AI for, and I've got people who are trained in it and have a knowledge of what it is and what it's supposed to do, that will suffice. There is a whole list of kind of courses that are available in terms of AI in Ireland by the expert group on future skills needs study. I know that's been kind of updated or will be updated. So there's a lot of courses kind of available on that. I suppose for us, it's about ensuring that there's as many pathways as possible for people to kind of acquire these skills, because if you think about the levels of skills that are going to be required, there's going to be people will need skills maybe to make or develop the AI, as it were, skills in deploying it, skills maybe in procuring it, skills in regulating it, skills in using it.
Yeah.
It is actually something that's kind of missed when people are reading the AI Act. It's a riveting read at 415 pages. But what's interesting about it to me is that what comes across is part of the obligation, if you're deploying it, is following the instructions of use.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's kind of a literacy in its way too.
But even reading the legislation is a skill in itself. I must admit, just doing that bit. So I just touching then on something that both Emer and Daniel commented on, and this really relates to kind of the ability to share data and to share it securely. Pets, privacy enhancing technologies, and just how these technologies really do benefit us and make it, more easily available for us to share data with that knowledge, knowing that it's secure and safe. Any thoughts on pets?
Just briefly weigh in on that. I mean, I think we have to even recognize that in many cases, AI tools themselves are pets, that, using these chatbots to ask questions, get answers to information that previously you might have to disclose information to another person. I mean, that is a privacy enhancing technology. And when we're evaluating, AI and the privacy risk it creates, we also have to look at the privacy benefits it creates and look at this kind of in combination. I think the biggest challenge that I see is that for the emergence of some of these large language models or other AI models, it's going to be very hard to test and verify that the models don't present any kind of privacy risk. They're non-deterministic systems, so you can't test them the way that you could test other systems. And that's going to be a challenge for regulators in the months ahead.
Yeah. And just I come from a regulator, so Commission Man is a regulator, but we're also a regulated entity. So we have to be cognizant of what we are responsible for, as well as what we need to be compliant with. So just touching on that, and I know various people have touched on it here already, that mapping exercise that you talked about, kind of Eric, that various pieces of legislation, that's no easy task, I must admit. When we're sitting down and we're looking at, say, the Digital Services Act, the Terrorist Content Online Regulation, the Online Safety and Media Regulation, all of those different elements, there's overlap, and sometimes there can be conflict. How from small businesses to big businesses to public sector bodies, how do we navigate the various pieces of legislation? And from my perspective, we're always thinking about which piece of legislation has the biggest bite. So I'll leave that open for. We'll start with you, Annette.
Yeah, it's a difficult exercise. I was very impressed with Eric's starburst of reliance and dependence between those different pieces of legislation. It just depends on what you're looking at. You look at it on a case-by-case basis. I find it useful to map the similarities between legislations first, if they set up governance elements, what they look like, and principles as well. I find that really steers and it's really helpful on a personal basis to understand what even should I be thinking about in terms of legislation, and what is similar and what does it look like in other legislation. So start simple is my solution.
Very good. Eric, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I suppose it is kind of promised, or it's in kind of the hinted at in kind of the political letters from President von der Leyen about a kind of a commitment to do kind of a review of the regulation we have to make it kind of work together. And I think, Emer touched on that as well, with the idea of the data union. Like, we do have a lot of different pieces of law now on data governance. It is kind of a question of, like, our definitions, etc., consistent. We have different bodies, like we've got data protection authorities, we've got the AI office. We have to align all those kind of objectives together, in implementing these laws. The other thing that's kind of, I suppose, the crux of what I was saying. The challenge I would see it is that there would be always a temptation to kind of go, let's just add on more law, right? Whereas I think that the real challenge is about trying to get the legislation we have to work. Now there may be gaps which may require legislation. I'm not ruling that out, but I am kind of starting from the point of view of, can we make sure that there's alignment between the various different things? And that was a very simple diagram. And again, I acknowledge IAPPB and that.
Yeah, they're very good with their.
They're very good.
Infographics, yeah.
So it's that alignment piece. But that's done through Emer's piece. Like, and I think her piece was quite nice. And I even hinted at it as well. It's a shared journey. It's not one party's going to solve this. It's working together that we will.
Now, I'm very conscious that my light is fading here. quite rapidly. So we have just about a minute left on this call. So if I can invite each of you to kind of give your concluding remarks. So I'll start, Emer, with you.
Sure. So maybe just trying to pick up on a couple of the different threads, and particularly that last piece around the convergence or the need for consistency and coherence around the different laws. And I was struck also by the metaphor of airspace and then Eric's or the IAPP diagram. And somebody from Sweden actually showed me an art project where they had tried to map the Swedish legal system in 3D. So maybe we need something like that. But I think there are a lot of new actors involved as well, some of whom may not be so familiar with this type of legislation. And we can already see that if we look at the number, so talking about data intermediaries, data altruism organizations, if we look at how many registered already across the EU, there are not very many. And I think for me, that's quite telling, because it shows that maybe people aren't ready yet or don't quite understand, they don't recognize themselves in the legislation. So I think there's a communication piece that has to happen. And that's actually something with the data altruism organizations. Member states will have to have communication strategies around this. I think as well, some of this will be around informal cooperation between different regulatory authorities, of which now there will be quite a few. And at Irish level, we have you have the Digital Regulators Group. And then I think also, looking at opportunities for automated compliance. So to take some of the burden, some of the bureaucratic burden away, and data spaces are actually a very good mechanism for that, because people who then access the data in the data space can hopefully be guaranteed that that data is already privacy compliant, is already compliant with other relevant EU data governance and sharing regulations. And then finally, I think there's also an opportunity for kind of open source compliance. So through the regulatory sandboxes, we can also think maybe about kind of unboxing those sandboxes and making that methodology and those sandboxes open to lots of different actors. So I think, there are barriers, but there are also a lot of opportunities here to think about how we understand and do regulation differently.
Thank you so much, Emer. Daniel?
I'll be very brief. I just want to go back to the point about inclusiveness that came up quite a few times. This is about making data governance work for everyone, making sure everyone can benefit from data-driven innovation. And I think there's been a broad recognition of the importance of closing the digital divide. And now in this new data economy that we're in, we need to focus on closing the data divide, making sure that there is data collected about everyone and their communities so that they can get the benefits of this technology and these advancements. Thanks.
That's great. And that they're represented as well within that data. Very good point. Thank you. Eric?
Sorry. For me, it's just, as I said, the success is going to be measured in terms of our digital progress as I kind of outlined in the slides. But making that a success is about alignment. It's an alignment of the actors. It's an alignment of the policies, the regulation, meaningful engagement, and I suppose trying to simplify this and make it as harmonious as possible. We have the rule book. It's about trying to implement it now, and I suppose like we have had this focus on developing it. We need to kind of move on that now, on the implementation, but also on the practice, as in, we've got to focus on building capacities to deliver the benefits, whether it be in the regulators or in the people who are actually going to make these innovations or use these innovations in a way that are going to benefit people, whether it's better services or private sector. I don't differentiate between the two. I actually see it as the same issue.
Thank you. Annette?
Very quickly, I know we're out of time. I think from a public service perspective, we should be optimistic that policy will bring us forward and bring change to people. Somebody mentioned the DESI index earlier. Ireland came out third as a data-driven public sector, out of 38 countries. And I think that is a basis for us to be optimistic into the future.
Thank you so much. So I'd like to thank everybody for taking part today. And I would invite you all to sign up to the IVI's newsletter. And the IVI Summit is happening this June. And so I encourage you to sign up for that and register for that. And the link is there. So it just leaves it to say thank you so much for everyone for a very engaging conversation, and best of luck. Thank you so much.